In a quiet neighborhood, Jonathan Carter's arrival has caused a stir. The only black man to move in, he had no idea that his dream home would become a test of his patience and dignity when his neighbor, a police officer, took matters to the brink. When guns were drawn and the truth revealed, the neighborhood would never forget that evening. Thank you for being here. Let us know where you are hearing this story from. If you like this content, don't forget to click like and subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Late afternoon, pale yellow sunlight spread over the shiny brick streets of the new urban area. This is a place famous for its peace and luxury, where large detached houses with carefully tended gardens are located close together. That is also the reason why Jonathan Carter, the head of the FBI investigation team, decided to buy a house here. A 45-year-old man with short hair, sharp eyes, and a dignified demeanor, Jonathan always dreamed of having a place to return to after stressful working days. His new house was at the end of the street, near a small park, with a white picket fence and a perfectly manicured yard. It was a new beginning for Jonathan. He had worked tirelessly to get where he was, and now he wanted a peaceful place to enjoy the fruits of his labor. Jonathan sat on a wooden bench in his front garden, sipping coffee as the late afternoon sun filtered through the trees. He told himself he had made the right decision. Little did he know, however, that this start would not be entirely smooth. The sound of a car engine broke the silence. A white and dark blue police car slowly pulled into the driveway and stopped in front of the house next door. Jonathan glanced over and saw a white man in his 40s, dressed in a police uniform, getting out of the car. He paid no attention, only nodding politely when the man glanced in his direction. Instead of entering the house, however, the man stopped and stared at Jonathan. His blue eyes were filled with curiosity and annoyance. After a few seconds, he walked straight toward Jonathan's garden, his demeanor firm and somewhat rude. "What are you doing here?" the man asked, his voice gruff. Jonathan looked up, trying to remain polite despite the unpleasant tone. "Hello, I just moved here. This is my new home." "Your house?" The policeman raised an eyebrow, his eyes filled with suspicion. "You mean you bought this house?" Jonathan smiled slightly, trying to keep his cool in the face of the other's insensitivity. "Yes, I just moved in yesterday. I'm Jonathan Carter." He stood up, politely extending his hand in greeting. The policeman didn't shake hands, just crossed his arms over his chest and looked Jonathan up and down, as if assessing something inappropriate. "Look," he said, his voice even but cold, "I've lived here for 8 years, and it's a very quiet neighborhood. Honestly, I don't think this is the place for you." Jonathan was momentarily stunned. He didn't need to ask to know what the officer meant. Still, he kept his cool, not wanting to make a big deal out of this on the first day. "It's interesting you say that," Jonathan replied, his voice calm but with a hint of edge. "I think I have every right to decide where I live, as long as I follow the rules. Thanks for the reminder." The officer frowned, clearly dissatisfied with Jonathan's answer. "I'm just saying, this area has certain standards. Perhaps another place would suit you better." This time, Jonathan couldn't contain his annoyance. He took a step forward, keeping his eyes squarely on the officer's. "Look, I don't know what your problem is with me, but I'm here to live, not to ask permission from anyone. If you don't have anything else to say, I think we should stop this conversation." The policeman glared at Jonathan, his lips pressed together. There was a heavy silence for a few seconds. Then he smiled faintly, but it was not a friendly smile. "I am just warning you, don't make things complicated. We don't want unnecessary trouble here." Jonathan watched the policeman turn and walk back to his house, feeling an undisguised hostility. He sighed, his cold eyes following his neighbor's every move. That evening, as Jonathan sat in his living room, he couldn't help but think about the events of the afternoon. As someone who had faced countless stressful and dangerous situations on the job, he knew how to handle provocateurs. But this time, the incident had not occurred at work, but in what should have been his home. Jonathan looked at his laptop, where the security cameras around the house were streaming live footage of the garden. He had carefully installed them soon after he got the house, as a routine from his job as an investigator. The police officer's words this afternoon made him feel more vigilant than ever. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Jonathan," he said to himself, his voice tinged with sarcasm. He knew that life here would be more than just quiet afternoons sipping coffee. The next morning, Jonathan Carter left home early to go for a run. The birds chirped in the trees, and the fresh morning air put him in a good mood. After returning home from his run, he prepared a light breakfast and began to review some work documents. As the head of the FBI investigation team, Jonathan often had to manage complex cases, but he always maintained a disciplined and moderate lifestyle. Around 10 a.m., as Jonathan was sitting in the garden reading a book, a familiar figure appeared. It was the white policeman from yesterday. Today, he was wearing casual clothes, but his attitude was no different from last time. "Jonathan Carter, right?" the man said, his voice full of mockery. Jonathan closed the book, his eyes calm but wary. "Yes, we met yesterday if I remember correctly." The man took a step forward, standing right next to the fence that divided the two houses. "My name is Roy Anderson," he introduced himself, but made no attempt to shake hands or be friendly. "I think we need to talk." Jonathan nodded slightly. "About what?" Roy leaned against the fence, arms crossed over his chest. "About you living here. Honestly, I don't think this area is suitable for someone like you." Jonathan frowned. He had been used to racist situations throughout his career, but hearing such words in his new home made him uncomfortable. "Roy," Jonathan replied, his voice calm but firm, "I bought this house with my own money. I follow all the rules, and I don't think I need anyone's permission to live here. If you have any problems, I think you should keep it to yourself." Roy smiled faintly, but his smile was not friendly. "Don't you understand? I'm trying to help you. I just want you to know that this is not the place for you. It would be better if you found another place, more suitable." Jonathan stood up, walked closer to the fence, and looked straight at Roy with a sharp gaze. "Roy, I don't know who you think you are, but I'll make it clear once again. I live here, and I don't need any advice from you." Roy clenched his fists, looking annoyed. "Fine," he said, his voice growing harsher. "But don't blame me if things get tough for you. I won't stand for you if you make a mess of this neighborhood." Jonathan showed no fear and even gave a slight smile. "Is that a threat, Roy? I hope you realize that your words can have consequences." Roy took another step, the two men now only inches apart, the low fence between them meaningless. "Look, Jonathan," Roy said, "I'm the cop here. I have the right to keep order in this neighborhood. If you don't like it, go ahead and complain." Jonathan replied slowly, his voice low but authoritative. "Mr. Roy, I am not one to be intimidated. I have worked with far more dangerous people than you. If you continue to behave like this, I will make sure you are held accountable." Roy laughed, but his laugh was full of contempt. "Well, we'll see," he said, and turned and walked back to his house, throwing a defiant look back. That afternoon, Jonathan received a call from the office. He spent a few hours on the phone and sending emails, trying to shake off the bad feeling Roy had brought. But he knew that this situation could not simply end like that. Hours later, as dusk began to tint the sky red, Roy Anderson, a white police officer, come home from a nearby bar. The anger still smoldered inside him, like a fire waiting to burst into flames. The thought that a black man would dare buy the house next door offended Roy. "Who does this guy think he is? Someone like him doesn't belong here," Roy muttered, staring at Jonathan Carter's new house. Unable to contain his irritation, Roy decided to confront Jonathan once more. This time, he wasn't going to stop at harsh words. Jonathan sat on the porch chair, enjoying the fresh air of his first evening in his new home. He sipped his tea, his eyes following the newly lit streetlights. The sound of heavy footsteps on gravel made him look up. Roy, his face red, was coming toward him. The policeman's eyes were angry and challenging. "Still here?" Roy growled, stopping in front of the wooden fence. Jonathan put his teacup down on the table and stood up, keeping his composure. "This is my home. I see no reason to leave." Roy stepped through the gate, heading straight for the courtyard in front of Jonathan. "Look, I made it clear. You don't belong here. If you have any self-respect, you should leave before things get any worse. Jonathan didn't answer right away. He looked straight at Roy, his eyes flashing with determination. What are you doing, Roy? This is not how a public servant should behave. I've been polite to you, but you're crossing the line. Jonathan's reply added fuel to the fire. Roy growled, his hand tightening on the gun at his side. Overstepping the mark? Let me tell you, this is my area. You will not be safe here. Then, in a fit of uncontrollable impulse, Roy pulled out a pistol and pointed it straight at Jonathan. Kneel! Now! Roy shouted, his voice emphasizing each word. Undeterred, Jonathan held his ground. He raised his hands to reassure Roy, his voice surprisingly calm. Roy, put the gun down. You're getting yourself into big trouble. Don't do anything you'll regret for the rest of your life. But Jonathan's warning only made Roy angrier. Don't lecture me. Who do you think you are to challenge me? Jonathan sighed, slowly pulling his phone out of his pocket. Roy narrowed his eyes, the gun in his hand still in place. Don't be stupid, Roy warned. There's nothing stupid about this, Jonathan replied, his voice calm. He dialed, and when the other end picked up, he said, Rick, I need you to come to my house right away. There's a serious problem. Your subordinates are pointing guns at me. About 10 minutes later, the red-blue lights of a police car lit up the street, and a patrol car stopped in front of Jonathan's house. Police Chief Rick Daniels stepped out of the car, his face hardening when he saw Roy still holding the gun pointed at Jonathan. Roy, Rick said, each word like nails hammering into the air. What the hell is going on here? Why are you pulling a gun on an unarmed citizen on his own land? Roy stammered, trying to find an excuse. Sir, I was just trying to keep order in the neighborhood. This man, I mean him, aroused my suspicions. I thought he was trespassing or had bad intentions. Rick stepped directly in front of Roy, separating him from Jonathan. Trespassing? In this neighborhood? In the house he legally owns? Rick tilted his head, his eyes sharpening. Do you know who you just insulted and threatened? Roy swallowed, trying to keep his composure. I don't know who he is, but this area isn't suitable for. He stopped, realizing he couldn't continue without giving himself away. Rick chuckled. You really don't know? Then let me tell you, the man you just pointed your gun at is Jonathan Carter, the head of the FBI, a man who has done more to protect this country than anyone I know. Roy paled, his eyes widening in surprise. Captain, FBI? Jonathan stepped forward, his face calm, but his eyes cold. Yes, I am the head of the FBI investigation team, and I was just held at gunpoint by a local cop who didn't like my presence in this neighborhood. How do you explain your actions, Roy? Roy was at a loss for words. He lowered his head and dropped the gun completely, but Rick wouldn't let him. You still have that gun in your hand? Rick shouted, snatching the gun from Roy and handing it to another officer who had just arrived on the scene. I can't believe this. Do you have any idea how much you've embarrassed our entire force? Roy mumbled. I just thought he... You don't think, Rick interrupted, his voice full of authority. Your job is to serve and protect, not to go around threatening your neighbors because of the color of their skin. Jonathan slowly pointed to the security cameras installed around his house. Roy, he said, his voice calm but authoritative, everything that happened was recorded on my security cameras. Every insult, every threat, even the moment you pulled a gun on me. Don't worry, I won't let any detail go unnoticed. Rick turned to Jonathan, his face full of guilt. Jonathan, I'm sorry about this. I didn't expect one of my employees to behave so badly. Jonathan nodded. Rick, I understand this is not your fault, but I cannot let this be covered up. Roy Anderson's actions not only threaten my personal safety, but also bring disrepute to the entire police force. Rick sighed, turning back to look at Roy with a disappointed expression. Roy Anderson, you are hereby suspended from duty immediately pending investigation. You have not only seriously violated the police code of conduct, but also violated the law. I will personally submit this report to the relevant authorities. Roy tried to defend himself, but his voice was weak. Sir, I didn't mean to. I didn't think it would go this far. No thought? Rick roared. You turned your gun on an innocent citizen on their own soil. You dare say you didn't think? Another police officer handcuffed Roy on Rick's orders. Roy's eyes were filled with fear and regret, but it was too late. After Roy was taken away, Rick turned back to face Jonathan. "Jonathan, I want to thank you for staying calm in this situation. Not everyone can do that when threatened with a gun." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Rick, I've been in situations far more dangerous than this, but I can't ignore this. If we want change, it has to start with people like Roy." Rick nodded in agreement. "I assure you this matter will be taken seriously. I will submit a full report to the higher-ups, and Roy will be held accountable for his actions." Jonathan looked at Rick, his eyes solemn. "Thank you, Rick. I hope this incident serves as a lesson to all those who are still prejudiced. We cannot allow hatred and racism to continue." Rick squeezed Jonathan's hand, a handshake that showed respect and commitment. "Rest assured, I will do everything in my power to keep people like Roy out of our force." The two men stood there for a moment in the setting sun. One was a stoic sheriff, the other a dignified FBI captain, both knowing that the road to justice and equality was long, but not one to be abandoned. The next day, Jonathan's quiet neighborhood was far from peaceful. News of his encounter with police officer Roy Anderson spread quickly, thanks to the security camera footage Jonathan shared with the FBI's legal team. The images of the officer threatening an innocent citizen with a gun, along with racially charged insults, sent shockwaves through the community. Early that morning, local television stations and journalists gathered outside Jonathan's home, hoping to get an official comment. However, Jonathan decided to remain silent with the media, saying that the matter should be left to the legal system to deal with the matter publicly. At the police station, the atmosphere was equally tense. Rick Daniels, the police chief, called an emergency meeting with all his staff. When he entered the meeting room, he could not hide his anger. The incident between Roy Anderson and Jonathan Carter is more than just a personal matter. It has seriously damaged the reputation of our entire force, Rick said, his voice ringing loudly in the silent room. Roy's actions not only violate our code of conduct, but they go against everything we stand for. I want you all to remember, we are here to serve and protect everyone, regardless of color, religion, or social class. Rick not only suspended Roy from work, but also personally signed his dismissal order and sent all the evidence to the prosecutor's office for legal action. It was inevitable that Roy would be prosecuted for armed intimidation and racial discrimination. Jonathan, meanwhile, did not sit idly by. As a veteran of complex cases, he understood that this case was an opportunity to spark a broader conversation about inequality and racism in society. He received calls from colleagues, friends, and civil rights organizations, all of whom expressed support and willingness to work together to bring this to light. Jonathan agreed to participate in a webinar hosted by a major civil rights organization, where he shared his story and emphasized the importance of retraining police forces to eliminate dangerous biases. "I don't want Roy Anderson to be punished just to make an example. I want him and others to realize that discrimination not only hurts individuals, but also weakens communities. To change, we need more than just punishment. We need education, dialogue, and systemic reform," Jonathan said at the conference. Roy's trial, which began a month later, attracted national attention. Security camera footage was shown to the jury in court. The graphic images of Roy's threatening behavior and abusive language made it quick for the jury to reach a verdict. Roy was sentenced to 6 years in prison for threatening with a weapon and abuse of power. Upon hearing the sentence, Roy bowed his head, his face filled with remorse. He realized, albeit belatedly, that his actions had not only ruined his career, but also deeply hurt the community. Jonathan's neighborhood has also changed dramatically since the incident. Neighbors who were initially wary and kept their distance from him have now approached him, bringing him small gifts and apologizing for not doing anything or speaking up when they witnessed Roy's abuse. One evening, a group of neighbors knocked on Jonathan's door. Led by a middle-aged woman, Mrs. Jane, who had previously kept her distance from him, she held an apple pie in her hand. "We owe you an apology," Jane said, her voice full of sincerity. "When you moved here, I admit I had my own prejudices, but this incident has opened my eyes. No one deserves to be treated the way Roy treated you." We regret not standing up for you when you needed us." Jonathan smiled, accepting the apple pie from her. "I appreciate everyone's generosity. Hopefully, together we can build a better community where no one feels excluded." That evening, Jonathan sat on his porch, looking up at the starry sky. Although the case was closed, he knew that the fight against injustice and discrimination continued. But he also believed that small steps like the changes in this neighborhood would lead to a more equitable future for everyone. Thank you for taking the time to read the whole story. If you love this content, don't forget to click like, share this story with friends and family, and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories.